through Broward, you go to the end of the street there, and that's like, it's an interesting place. They give you, I've never been there, but I read it. It's, they don't have food. But they bring those food trucks, they have them around, and they bring it up there, you buy the food, and then you go in and they give you like those craft beers. Well, you don't know what too young. There's like craft beers. Seems like an interesting place. All right. Before we begin with our other review, is there anybody who is taking the AP test that did not receive our booklet? Right? Okay, let me give this, still feeding back a little bit to McKenna. Anybody else did not receive this booklet if you are taking the AP test? Who?
Jason.
Oh, Jason? Here you go, Jason. Coming up to Jason. All right. Also, if you are taking the AP test, did anybody not get this AP practice test? Now, this AP practice test is good. This should be anybody, because you are going to take a final examination in our class the day before the AP test, and it's going to basically be this. So even if you're not taking the AP test, you should take a copy of this to study from. Natalie, there you go. Is that right? Ah! Blasted! I'm sorry, Kristen. Don't call me Meredith. So that's why everyone kept looking at me when I was calling you Meredith.
It's called Meredith.
Is that right? I apologize for that. Sometimes I get them wrong. Anybody else not get this? I don't have the answers for this right now. And the reason I don't have the answers is because I can either sit down and like look at it and do the answers or look them up. But both of them are going to take me time. And so I'll do it though eventually. Now, the other thing that if you do not have, you might take is this practice test 1. Again, this is the multiple choice questions in the format of the AP. Even if you are not taking the test, the AP test, it still would be helpful in studying for that final test that's not counting as a final. So when you take the final exam in here, it's going to be on the Thursday before the AP test. It will not count as the final, but it will be comprehensive. So it will only count as a 9 weeks grade, one of your 9 weeks grades. And like I told you before, what we're going to do is we're going to take that final examination, which will be, similar to what I'm passing out, and then after school on that day go over it. So those of you that aren't taking the AP test, you'll just get it back the next day. Those of you who are taking the AP test, will come back here after school and go over it, and that will be the last thing we do in preparation for the test. And so we'll get a sense like maybe there's topics that, questions that you didn't know, we'll review them and, look at those questions, and that will be the last thing we'll do. But it will count, for a 9-week grade. This is another version. This is from your textbook. If you did not get this, anybody not get this, the same people. Jason, what are you doing? Why are you looking at those things on the internet today? What did I do against you, Jason? Did I do something against you? I mean, I expect it from Darius, right? Do you think? Yes, they are different. That's why I gave it to you. I want you to have both of them. Okay. We're in serious trouble here. We can't even pass the papers out. You need both? Yes. Who else? Christine, Mary, Christine. So you're a super good pitcher on the softball team. Now, One other thing. I'm going to pass this around. If you are not taking the AP test, you can pass this along. You know, don't take it. If you are, take a copy of it and then just pass it up and down the road. And then it's going to end up with the Vickers or Antonio. You can give me what's left. Right? You know, it might take too long. Here. Yeah, pass them out. Because I wanted to mention that before we start reviewing for the test on 29, 30, and 28, 29, and 30. So, what you are getting, just really quickly, Natalie's passing these out. What you are getting is 2 examples of questions that the College Board is offering as examples of what they're calling the long essay. So remember, for those of you that are taking the AP test, everybody look at me. For those of you that are taking the AP test, you have to write 2 essays, right? One is called the long essay. And the long essay is similar to what you've done in class. The other is called the document-based essay. And on some level, the document-based essay is similar to what you're doing with the West, what you did at the midterm, and what you're doing with the 1920s question. Now, the long essay, well, the essays that you're doing in class are all essays that were asked on AP tests in the past. These 2 questions here are examples of the kinds of questions that they are arguing they're going to give you this year. Look at them quickly. Everybody take a look at them. Those of you that aren't taking the AP test, just remain quiet for a moment. We'll get to you in a second. But if you look at these 2 questions, question 1 says, evaluate the extent to which the Declaration of Independence marked a turning point in American history, analyzing what changed and what stayed the same from the period immediately before the Declaration to the period immediately following. The second question, which also says question 1, says, some historians argue the American Revolution was not revolutionary in nature. Support, modify, or refute this interpretation, providing specific evidence to justify your answer. Here's my question to you. In what ways are these 2 questions... Now, Sylvia, what are you doing? I had a dramatic moment here, Sylvia, just for fun. But go ahead and resume, go back to your seat. You can go around if you want, or if you want to try to sneak underneath it. So, as Sylvia, who was a contortionist a moment ago, is returning to her seat, I guess my question to you is, looking at these 2 questions, and we'll bat them about a bit on Thursday, but looking at these 2 questions, how are these 2 questions similar, right? I mean, I don't think that these 2 questions are the same question, but are these 2 questions similar? Take a look at them. And how are they similar? Now, look at the second one. It says, some historians have argued the American Revolution was not revolutionary in nature. Right? That's almost like an assess the validity, right? So look at what they say next. Support, modify, or refute. So support is, I agree, it wasn't revolutionary in nature. Refute is, it was revolutionary. Modify is, I'm going to change that. Okay. Now, go to the top one. What's the top one about? There are 2 things in that top question that they're asking you to look at. What are they? What are the 2 things? Yeah, go ahead.
To evaluate the extent to which Declaration of Independence marked the turning point in American history.
Okay, the turning point in what regard? Say it, John. What changed and what stayed the same? Right? If the American Revolution was radical, what would that be saying about change? So if the American Revolution was radical, what would that be saying about change? Yes, it would be saying there was a lot of change, right? So if you thought there was a lot of change, what would you say about the second question? That it was in fact revolutionary. So you would refute that, correct? So on some level, Jewel, these questions are similar in that they are focusing on the amount of change that resulted from the American Revolution. But the first question is saying not only what changed, but what, say it, Jewel, not only what changed, but what stayed the same, right? Now look at that question just really quickly, and then we'll get to 29, 30, and 40. One of the big things that I keep seeing in all the AP tests is this notion of continuing, that's how you say it.
Continuous.
No. Continuity. Continuity, thank you. Continuity and change, right? Continuity means that things remain the way they were. Change means the way that things that changed. And that's what they're asking in that first question. As a result of the Declaration of Independence, what changed and what stayed the same? Right? That's a big push. A lot of the essay questions pick up on that notion. What changed? What stayed the same? Continuity and change. Right? Continuity and change. What stayed the same? What changed? Now the second question is all about whether things changed or whether they stayed the same. But they're similar, right? So when we do our thing on Thursday, we'll go through. We'll start with the end of the French and Indian War, and the Stamp Act and the Quartering Acts and all that legislation, the Revolution, and then hopefully conclude by trying to brainstorm things that might fit in to that response if you were going to respond to it. So to try to put it into that context. So hang on to that. Bring it with you. I'll bring extra copies because the kids always forget. But and here's some extra copies here. So now let's go to 28, 29, 30. And when we started this unit, chapters 28 in the American Pageant, chapters 29 in the American Pageant, chapters 30, the core of that is progressivism. Right? So we started by talking about progressivism as being a response to urbanization and industrialization. So what progressivism was ultimately a large number of people seeking to modify society in ways that might prevent radical change, right? So it was a reform movement. And so what did the reformers intend to do? What did they want to accomplish, right? Well, yeah, go ahead, Dave.
So progressivism was also a response to urbanization and industrialization, and also with us.
I don't know what I said. What did I say? I have no idea. What else what did I say?
Progressives wanted to do.
Yeah, I posed a question, but I don't remember what I said before. I'm sorry. I just don't remember. Okay. Anyways, back to focusing on this question. What do the progressives want to do? Well, what they want to do is soften the rough edges of industrialization and urbanization, right? And how do they want to do that? They want to do it by using government. So the progressives want to kind of reform society, to temper the rough edges of industrialization and urbanization, to ameliorate the worst results of industrialization and urbanization. And in order to do that, they want to use the power of government at every level. Local government, state government, and national government. Now, we talked a little bit about the roots of progressivism. And we said the political roots of progressivism, the idea of using government to effectuate change, come from the populist. The populists believed that the power of government had been taken over by corporate interests. And they proposed to use the power of government to promote the welfare of people. Right? So they wanted government to be the instrument or the agent of change. The progressives are going to pick up on this. And they're going to look to government to make the changes and the reforms that are going to kind of curve out the rough edges of industrialization and urbanization, to ameliorate the worst effects of it. And remember, we said the progressives are inspired to some extent by fear. They fear the status quo. The status quo puts too much power in the hands of too few people that, in their view, are inconsistent with the ideology of America. And they fear the results of that status quo might be radical change, anarchism and socialism. So in order to save the country from the status quo and from radical change, they propose to use the power of government to reform, to make better, to improve. Right? And we said this impulse comes from politically the populist. Where does it come from religiously? You know, when we, yes.
Protestant work that?
Well, not necessarily, yeah, go ahead, dear Vickers. Did she say the social, you said the social gospel? Social gospel, yes. And what is, now Vickers, continue on with that. Tell us about the social gospel. Pardon me? Yes, that poverty was not a result of sin, but it was a result of circumstance. So therefore, what Christians were obliged to do was to try to make circumstances better, to eliminate poverty and problems. Now, we said that the roots of progressivism were, you know, populism, the social gospel, and also mugwumpery. You know, what was mugwumpery? Remember we said, go ahead, Joel. Pardon me? Yes, the mugwumps were that Republican faction that wanted the best people to govern. Wanted the best to govern. Wanted to get rid of what they saw as opportunist politicians who would try to use the power of government for their own advantage rather than for the public good. So they wanted people who were committed to the public good. So if you think about, you know, the social gospel, and if you think about the populist ideology, and you think about the notion of mugwumpery, you see all of those things kind of being manifested in progressivism, in the different aspects of progressivism. You know, most importantly, trying to deal with, with government, right? Because if government is going to be the instrument of agent of change, it's got to be cleaned up, less corrupt, etc. Now, who were the muckrakers and how do they connect to progressivism? Who were the muckrakers and how do they connect to progressivism? Go ahead, Joel.
Muckrakers were the journalists that looked up like social problems in society and connects to progressivism because it inspired change.
Yes. I mean, the muckrakers were journalists, right? Who published what we called exposés that exposed the worst problems in society and hopefully inspired people to promote change. What names do we associate? Go ahead, Antonio. Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell are two people that we associate with muckraking. Generally, they are considered to be classic muckrakers because their exposés were factual accounts that were published in magazines that were committed to muckraking. Upton Sinclair's published a muckraking novel, which seems to be somewhat inconsistent. Go ahead. Veronica. Mallory. There you go.
Can you do The Jungle?
Yes. Upton Sinclair publishes The Jungle in 1906. And Valerie, what was the context of The Jungle? What was the story there?
It talks about like the horrors of a meat factory.
Yes, of the meatpacking industry, the suffering of the people there. And interesting, Sinclair's intent was to expose not the way that the meat was treated and how unsanitary and unsafe it was, but Sinclair's intent was to expose how terrible things were for the workers. That is not what comes out of The Jungle. What comes out of The Jungle is kind of this how terrible and how unsanitary the meat, packing industry was, and it kind of leads to reform. Now, a big part of that reform was to clean up government and to make it more democratic. Now, on the state level, what the progressives wanted to do, and we discussed this, we talked about progressivism and kind of reforming government on the local level. And on the local level, the city level, the emphasis of progressives was efficiency, right? We want city government to be efficient. The city has to deliver services to the people. And so those services should not be delivered by political hacks or inefficient people that are connected and hired because of patronage. They should be delivered by professional public servants who are trained in the delivery of those services. Scientific management. Frederick Taylor is the name that's associated with scientific management, and his ideology should be applied to providing services on the city level. So on the city level, it is about efficiency. And remember, we talked about the Galveston model, the big hurricane in Galveston, Texas, when a commission was appointed to run the city, and how they employed kind of professional management techniques and how well that it worked. On the state level, right? On the state level, the emphasis of progressivism was to break the power of the political bosses by making state government more responsive to the people. Right? To break the power of the political bosses by making state government more responsive to the people. And there were a number of ways that progressives attempted to do that. One way, well, one of the ways was the referendum, recall, initiative, and these were all things that bypassed elected officials and allowed the people to directly influence state government. Now, with the power of state government, progressives had certain objectives. And one of those objectives was safety in the workplace and disability insurance to people that were injured, accident insurance to people that were injured on the job, which was a huge problem. Now, the issue of workplace safety and accident insurance is going to really get national attention as a result of the Triangle Shortwave fire in 1911. The Triangle Shortwave fire in 1911, 146 young girls are going to be killed in this horrible fire. Many of them are going to leap out 10 stories to their death. And so the progressives are going to respond on the state level by passing legislation to protect workers and to provide disability insurance to people who were injured at the workplace, and to generally eliminate some of the terrible conditions, the sweatshop kind of conditions that people were working in. Yes?
What was that place where all the schools?
Pardon me?
What was the name of the place?
Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Now, we talked about progressivism on the local level, on the state level, and then we eventually got to progressivism on the national level. And we argued that Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson could all be considered progressives. Now, what was the name of Roosevelt's political agenda? Go ahead, Antonio. Well, yes, but before the New Nationalism, while he was in office, yes, the Square Deal. What event in Roosevelt's administration, and remember, Roosevelt takes the presidency, ascends to the presidency upon McKinley's death in 1901. And he argues that what he's giving to the American people is a square deal. What event more than anything seemed to embody the notion of not being for the rich guy, not being for the poor guy, but providing to everyone a square deal? Yes? Yes, the 1902 coal strike. So the 1902 anthracite coal strike Roosevelt intervenes and attempts to mediate the strike and eventually forces management to accept arbitration to an agreement that appears to be equitable to everyone involved, including the public. And he is going to use that notion of a square deal to kind of be the moniker of his administration. Now, we also said that domestically Roosevelt stressed three things: corporations, consumerism, and conservation. When we think of corporations, two things that Roosevelt is going to kind of be known for. One is trust busting, which to some extent Roosevelt's efforts at trust busting seemed inconsistent. Why? So he breaks up these companies, but it's inconsistent with his ideology. Why? Go ahead. Well, I mean, what Charlie said is because he was a conservative and he liked big government, and it was inconsistent to break up these trusts. I'm not sure if it had to do with like his notion of big government. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, he understood modern capitalism, meaning that trusts weren't needed for capitalism.
Right. So then Roosevelt did not necessarily think that trusts were inherently evil. The concentration of economic power into large corporations that controlled competition, Roosevelt said was inevitable. Right? So then, Jason, how did he justify breaking up trusts? If the trust was an inevitability, then how did he justify breaking it up?
He thought it was bad, good, bad.
Yes. So it wasn't about the trust being big and powerful and controlling competition. It was about the trust being abusive. So if the trust was irresponsible with the power that they obtained, then the government would regulate them by breaking them up. If they were not, if they were responsible, then the government would leave them alone. What was the name of the first antitrust suit? What was the company he went after?
Northern Securities.
The Northern Securities Company, 1902. Right? Now, in addition to that, he also is going to regulate companies for consumer benefit. So corporations, breaking up trusts and, making sure that trusts behave responsibly. But also consumerism meant regulating corporations for consumer benefit. Now, what legislation do we associate with consumer protection? Yes?
Meat inspection and the Pure Food.
Yeah, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act are both responses to the jungle, right? But also the Elkins and Hepburn Acts. What were they? What were, Stephanie, the Elkins and Hepburn Acts, what industry did they deal with? Do you recall?
I can't find it in the
I jumped on you, did I not, Stephanie?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alex.
They're the railroads?
Yes, they dealt with regulating the railroads. So when we talk about Roosevelt, we say corporations, and that usually is trust busting. When we talk about consumerism, that usually is regulating either the meat, the food industry, the railroads. And then we talk about conservation. Now, conservation is something that Roosevelt is kind of most known for, most distinguished for. And when we talked about conservation, we said that Roosevelt was a conservationist, not an environmentalist or a preservationist. So what did we say was the difference between a conservationist or an environmentalist or preservationist? Marissa, do you recall, remember how interested you were when we were talking about this topic? You were nodding approvingly. Do you recall the difference?
What was your question?
Oh my goodness. What were you thinking, Marissa? Were you daydreaming?
A little bit.
A little bit. I don't blame you. Look at Sylvia's texting, so that's not as bad as daydreaming. Yes, go ahead, Antonio. So tell me again. Okay, so the conservationist wants to conserve the natural environment for multiple human use, right? What does the environmentalist want to do, Nate?
He wants it completely locked out from any human habitation or use of whatsoever.
Well, I don't know that he used to say completely like you can walk through it, but the environmentalist wants to preserve it for its own sake, right? Not for potential human exploitation. Nature for nature. Oh, just for fun because it will be on the AP test. They love this guy. Who is the embodiment of environmentalism? Not on your test, but it will be on the AP test. Yes, go ahead. John Muir, right? Is it M-U-I-R or M-I-U-R? Oh, really? How does somebody, that's not the right spelling. What is the right spelling? Anybody have it? Is it M-U-I-R? John Muir. And he is an environmentalist, right? He wants to, and he's most famous, John Muir, for founding what organization, which is still in existence to this day? Go ahead, Marissa, you can redeem yourself. The Sierra Club. Now, the conservationist that Roosevelt was most aligned with was not Muir, but who? Yes?
George Pinchot?
No, Gifford Pinchot.
Oh, Gifford.
Gifford Pinchot. Does anybody besides myself and Malay Shah remember what position Gifford Pinchot held in the Roosevelt and later in the Hughes administration? Go ahead, Malay Shah. Yes, he was the chief forester for the Department of Agriculture, right? Now, and he remained in that position even after Roosevelt left. And remember, it is that conflict between Pinchot and Bollinger that really is going to begin to alienate Roosevelt from Taft. But Pinchot and Roosevelt are multi-use conservationists, right, that want to preserve the environment for future use. Now, one last thing about Roosevelt. Besides pursuing this domestic agenda, which is generally considered to be progressive on some level, right? Whether it is dealing with, breaking up trusts or protecting consumers or promoting conservation, it is generally considered to be progressive. He also increases the power of the presidency and the prestige of the presidency. Now that's where we kind of got into, a discussion that many of you got into in your papers. What does this make him? If Roosevelt wants to see a powerful presidency, a powerful central government to kind of regulate the economy and society for the public good, does this make him a liberal or a conservative? And, most of you said it made him a conservative, right? And you hung your hat on arguing that he strengthened the power of the national government. Is that wrong? Well, no, right? It's not wrong. I mean, clearly, there's a point to be made there. If you stick with it, you could have made that point well. But, there is certainly a contradiction because, the contradiction is that he's going to use the power of government not to promote economic growth like Hamilton had done, but to use the power of government to sort of protect the people, to promote this progressive objective, right, which sort of complicates his political position a little bit. And the same is true with Wilson. Well, all right. We know that Roosevelt decides that he is not going to seek re-election, and he handpicks Taft, who is also a Republican, who he is confident that Taft is going to continue his policies. So William Howard Taft is the Republican successor to Roosevelt. It is Taft in 1908 who runs against William Jennings Bryan for the third and final time. Bryan is defeated and Taft takes over. Now, when Taft takes over, the problem that Taft encounters is a conflict within the Republican Party between the progressive wing of the party, which is called the insurgency, and the conservative wing of the party, which is called the old guard. And Taft does not have the political acumen to kind of manage this conflict as well as Roosevelt had done. Roosevelt had was personally popular. Roosevelt had strong political skills. Roosevelt had charisma. And Roosevelt was shrewd. Taft was smart. But this kind of political infighting and all those things were beyond what he had really an inclination to address. And so throughout the Taft administration, Taft is going to increasingly side with the old guard against the insurgency. The end result of this conflict is the 1912 Republican Convention, where Roosevelt, the insurgent, the progressive, is denied the nomination and Taft, the conservative, gets it. Roosevelt divides the party by leaving, and then, then he is nominated by this new party, the Progressive Party. Jane Addams puts his name in nomination, and that kind of is a symbol of the importance of women in progressivism. And women are really important in progressivism. They make up a lot of the progressive reforms. They advocate for things like prohibition and women's suffrage. And women's suffrage becomes a part of progressivism because the progressives believe that women will clean up the electorate. Roosevelt, in the election of 1912, boldly puts forth the notion of the new nationalism, where he kind of quantifies his whole ideology about the role of government, the role of business, and the relationship to the people. And in the new nationalism, remember what Roosevelt believes is almost like a giant referee-type national government that will kind of make sure that the interests of everyone are protected. Business, consumers, and Roosevelt's new nationalism encompasses more than that. The new nationalism is women's suffrage, the 8-hour day. But in the center of it is a powerful national government that is going to ensure that people have kind of this equal protection. Yes?
So Wilson's is like kind of almost like the opposite of that?
No. Wilson's New Freedom, I don't know if I would say it's the absolute opposite.
As far as business goes.
Well, no, I think in terms of business, that both and why I said no so quickly, is that I think both Wilson and Roosevelt want to do something with business. They want to regulate business. It's just a matter of how. So I don't know that you would call that opposite as different ways to get at the same end. So they want to protect the people from the power of business. Where's everybody? Why is everybody, where are they going? Why are they leaving? What did I do? Marissa, what did I do that they're leaving? You know what I have to say? Buenas noches, so that's why you made it a fair fight. Tony, things aren't tough enough. Is that pretty good?
Tony
Yeah. Things aren't tough enough. Doc, I'm in love. How do you know? Right? Yeah. He's naive. He's not a man of the world. Well, okay, back to the difference. So I disagreed with Nate that they're exact opposites. The new nationalism and new freedom are different ways to get to the same place. Roosevelt wants to get to protecting people from the power of corporations by a powerful national government that will regulate those corporations to ensure their responsibility. Wilson wants to protect the people by breaking up those corporations and promoting competition. And that competition will ensure that the interests of consumers and people are protected. So the reason I say maybe they are exact opposites, Nate, in terms of their approach, but their objectives are not exact opposites.
So they're trying to reach the same goal, trying to get business as fair as they can.
But in different ways, right? Now, in the election of 1912, besides Woodrow Wilson, who advocates the new freedom and is nominated by the Democratic Party, there is Theodore Roosevelt, who advocates the new nationalism and is nominated by the Progressive Party. William Howard Taft, who is the Republican nominee and sort of supports conservatism and the old guard, and Eugene V. Debs, who is the socialist, who we mentioned today, was imprisoned in 1918 under the Sedition Act and remained in prison because of his principled opposition to World War I until 1921. Incidentally, when he was released from prison in 1921, all the prisoners in the Atlanta prison demanded that they be released from their cells to wish him farewell. He made that kind of an impression on even the inmates in that penitentiary. Eugene V. Debs, a remarkable person and my idol. Now, all right. Wilson wins the election of 1912, and when he does so, he is going to attack the triple wall of privilege: tariffs, banking, and corporations, right? Monopolies. Now, in order to do that, Wilson is going to appeal over the heads of elected officials at times and directly to the people. And he does that, one way that he does that is by appearing personally before Congress. He is the first president since Jefferson to do that. So Wilson is going to use pretty significant speaking skills to pursue his agenda, and he has some success. He gets tariff legislation passed, the first tariff reduction since the Civil War. What's the name of the legislation? Does anyone recall? Yes, go ahead, Vickers. The Underwood Act also had tariff reduction, but also included something else, McKenna. What was it? In addition to reducing tariffs, it provided the first income tax, right? The first income tax, which is significant. Now, just stay with me for another moment. Now, that first income tax was initially considered to be unconstitutional, but was constitutionally permitted by an amendment to the Constitution. One of four progressive amendments. Which amendment? Go ahead, D'Antonio. The 16th Amendment. Remember, the 16th Amendment made the income tax constitutional. The 17th Amendment, Joel, was... See, I'm snapping my fingers so you can say the answer. Go ahead. Direct election of senators. 18th Amendment was prohibition. 19th Amendment was women's suffrage. Again, 16th Amendment was income tax. 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. 18th Amendment, prohibition. 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. All of these are responses to progressivism, right? Income tax, progressive reform, lower tariffs, tax the rich, help out the common person. Direct election of senators, break the power of the corporations to influence state governments by choosing senators. Prohibition, take booze away from people. That will mean a cleaner electorate. Women's suffrage, women will make better voters and embrace progressive reforms more. All of those are considered to be progressive reforms. Right? Now, okay. In addition to the Underwood Act, Wilson is also going to promote the Federal Reserve Act and the Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act. So those pieces of legislation, there are questions on the test about, right? The Federal Reserve Act does two things. It creates central banks, 12 of them in 12 locations across the country that are privately owned. But it also creates a Federal Reserve Board that is government oversight. So there is a combination in the Federal Reserve System between private ownership of central banking, private influence, and government oversight. The government oversight comes in the form of an appointed governmental board that oversees the system. The Clayton Antitrust Act made various anti-competitive actions illegal, including interlocking directorates. The Clayton Antitrust Act also specifically stated that labor unions were not illegal restraints of trade. So, the Clayton Antitrust Act is going to be significant. Samuel Gompers is going to call the Clayton Antitrust Act labor's Magna Carta, right? It's kind of foundational document because it's basically giving labor legal recognition. It's not an illegal restraint of trade. Remember, that's what was ruled in the Pullman strike, that labor unions were illegally restraining trade under the Sherman Antitrust Act. So this is going to refute that. Yes, go ahead.
You said they were not, labor unions not illegal restrictions on trade as
Yes.
well?
There were not illegal restraints of trade.
What else did it do?
It made certain anti-competitive practices illegal, like interlocking directories. Now, there is a question on the test, all the kids look at me, there is a question on the test about Wilson and Mexico. So if you read chapter 29 in your textbook, which I'm sure you haven't, but if you did, you would see that the first part of chapter 29 talks about Wilson's domestic policies. Wilson is elected to the presidency, he attacks the triple wall of privilege, he has great success in doing so, and this is in 1913. He also has, international issues, and the biggest of those international issues is, of course, the World War I, which is June of 1914. So Wilson is not president for long before World War I breaks out. But he also has kind of a conflict with Mexico that's pretty significant. So you might want to take a peek at that in your notes. But, yes, go ahead.
Is this like a fight with Pancho Villa?
Pancho Villa, yes. So you might want to take a look at that in your notes. More significant is Wilson and World War I. So we have been talking about that. And in our conversation about World War I, what we said was this, that World War I eventually degenerates to a conflict between the Allies and the Central Powers. The Allies are England and her allies, England, France, and Russia. The Central Powers are Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now, one of the interesting things that we have been talking about is what they were fighting about in the first place. And we said that the war was prompted really at the core by imperialism, industrialization, competition for resources, competition for colonies, and really the unification of Germany. Now, eventually, at first the United States is absolutely committed to not intervening in that war. But eventually they do so. And we were talking a little bit about that. And we said that, the reason that America eventually, where's everybody going? Where are they going?
Lacrosse.
Lacrosse. Yeah. Don't you practice at 7 p.m.?
Big game today.
Against who?
Hempfield.
Oh. Hempfield. McKenna Hempfield. The hated Westmoreland County-ites. Yeah, so you'll crush them. Now, okay, so Americans are absolutely committed to staying out of the war. But eventually what draws them in is England's control of the seas and Germany's response to that. Why does England control? Well, England controls the seas because they have a powerful navy. With that powerful navy, what do they do? Yes, go ahead. And so with that control of trade, Charlie, they reduce our trade with Germany to virtually nothing, right? Then the United States trade with England and the Allies soars. Trade with Germany to nothing. The Germans respond to that with what, Marissa? One word. Up periscope. The submarine. Right? The submarine is Germany's response to the circumstances with England's control of the ocean. The United States is this industrial powerhouse that's providing the Allies with munitions, arms, loans, money, food, all of these things, and England is protecting that trade with their powerful navy. Now, England is also preventing the same neutral power, the United States, for trading with them. So, with trading with Germany. The United States said, we're more than willing to trade with Germany, but can't because of England. The United States is not willing to hold England accountable for that. So Germany responds by saying, okay, we are going to employ this new technology, the submarine, to attempt to limit that trade. When they do that, the United States chooses to assert themselves. Say, look, we're not going to accept this. We're not going to accept, you know, sinking passenger vessels and merchant vessels without warning. And if Germany continues to do that, then we'll eventually break off diplomatic relations. Yes?
That's a good question. Was World War I the post-war treaties that they...
What? I didn't hear you.
Was it the post-war treaties that they...
Jason, tell me.
He's asking if World War I was the first war to use submarines.
Yeah, I think so. I think so, yeah. All right. So, eventually it boils down to the Sussex Pledge, right? And the Sussex Pledge is when the United States says, look, either you stop this or we break off diplomatic relations. And Germany backs down, right, and accepts the Sussex Pledge, right? Now, they revoked the Sussex Pledge in late January, early February of 1917. And we talked about kind of the dynamics of that today. The reason they revoked it is the gamble. They suspected that they would be able to win the war prior to the United States making a difference. And the gamble was, on some level, reasonable. You know, I mean, it does take a full year for the United States to intervene. Now, after we talked about, you know, the dynamics of eventually Germany revoking the Sussex Pledge, you know, the actions that the Germans took, the Russian Revolution, and Wilson's eventual declaration of war, or request for a declaration of war, then what we talked about was mobilization. Now, in terms of mobilization, the only thing that we discussed was the restriction of, was propaganda and the restriction of civil liberties. Now, tomorrow and the next day, we're going to talk about the end of the war, the wind down of the war. That is over 10 questions on the test. So over 10 questions on the test is from the Bolshevik Revolution that we introduced in October of 17 through the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, which is in 1919 and 1920. So if you wanted to read an important 6 pages in your book, it would be the last 6 pages of chapter 30. And if you wanted to pay attention, let's say, Jason, you didn't want to, remember how you were doing the cell phone today instead of paying attention in class, right? So let's say you wanted to pay attention to stuff that there would be a lot of payoff. It would be over the next 2 days, right? Okay, so that is it for today, and it's only 3:30, Natalie, and that's not bad. All right. Eric, if somebody was the main man besides you, I wouldn't believe it. You're the main man. Well, no one can replace you. They're all apart.